Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the time zone across our country. Welcome to our latest Texas Instruments STEM Exchange session. Tonight's session is going to be empowering, engaging educators and students using cross-cutting concepts to prompt students' sense-making of phenomena. And my name's Peter McLaren. I'm going to be your host tonight. A little bit about the TI STEM Exchange series. It is an opportunity for STEM educators to come together to learn, to share, to discuss, to explore about STEM education in general. Each month, what we try to do is we survey around the country what's going on that's innovative, that's uplifting, that is different in STEM education. And we try to bring together those panelists to be able to share their ideas. And in turn, what we hope is that you as the audience member are not going to be passive. This is the opportunity for you to interact with the panelists, to learn some things, to be able to question some things, and all of us will be able to learn more deeply about STEM education in general. What we really hope that you appreciate most about it is that this is, again, it's not a static opportunity. We are going to engage with you in a way that you could work with other participants as well as the panelists, but it's about engaging that conversation to be able to learn most definitively through breakout discussion groups. And speaking of STEM professionals, we've got a great lineup here for you tonight. You're going to hear more about them, but we have Stacy Vanderveen, who is going to be our moderator. I'm going to introduce her in a second. She's from Lead in Science out of Raritan, New Jersey. Our panelists are Brett Molding from Utah, Rachel Manzer from Connecticut, and Candace Penrod from Salt Lake City, Utah. They're all great professionals and they all have very strong working knowledge on cross-cutting concepts. We are going to be recording tonight's session. At the end of this slide presentation, you're going to see a slide and we're going to talk to you about looking for your email that you're going to receive a link to not only the PowerPoint, but also to the recording link. So you have a chance to review it, share with other colleagues, do whatever you like to. And I also know that many of you are very familiar with Zoom. And so that being said, what you really want to do with that is to be able to look at the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom window and select the speaker view that you really like to use. Please mute yourself whenever you're not speaking, but when I say mute yourself when you're not speaking, we do encourage you to use a hand raise or use a chat box or what have you to let us know if you want to be able to comment in. Would be a really great opportunity. You're going to have that opportunity throughout the video. So with that, I am very honored to be able to present our moderator tonight, Stacy Vanderveen. I'm not going to just, you can all read the bio behind her. But it has been my absolute pleasure to know Stacy for, oh gosh, it's got to be going on at least 9 years now. And one of the things about STEM education is that the community that we all work in is very, very small in terms of we know the people that are really making a difference. And Stacy and her husband Will are making a huge difference through leadership in science. And what I would value for Stacy is she's not only going to be moderating it, this presentation, but she's also going to be adding in some comments here and there and hopefully be able to have a chance to be able to share your own experience. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Stacy. Stacy, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Peter, and welcome everyone. I want to start by thanking you all for learning with us tonight as we deepen our understanding of the cross-cutting concepts. I'm lucky enough to spend a lot of my time working elbow to elbow with teachers as they learn to implement three-dimensional instruction. And I find that in general, the cross-cutting concepts are really unfamiliar. They're not at our fingertips the way core ideas are because we're familiar with content. They're not as familiar as the practice is because they resemble, even though they're not exactly the same as hands-on investigations with our students. But this is good news. This is good news because it means we have a fresh start, a blank slate. We have no bad habits to break, only the opportunity to learn how to use these tools as a lens to look through as we investigate phenomena. So as Peter mentioned earlier, we have an outstanding panel here to share their expertise with you. First is Brett Moulding, the director of Pestle. And while Brett's bio is up there, I just want to highlight a couple of things. Brett has sort of lived the gamut of education. He was a classroom teacher, he was a state science supervisor, and he had a huge impact on the national level, not only helping to write the framework, but the NGSS and the Science and Engineering for grades 6 to 12 Investigation and Design at the Center, which is a free publication from the National Academies, which if you haven't read it, you should download it immediately because it's outstanding. And we'll be talking about it tonight. Brett has also published a number of books and works with teachers across the country, really helping them think about how do they bring three-dimensional education to life in their classrooms. I am especially excited that Brett's here tonight because Brett's really the person who introduced me to the crucial role that cross-cutting concepts play in three-dimensional instruction. But Brett is not here alone. We are also joined tonight. I'm really excited to introduce, sorry, I'm so excited, I'm stumbling over my words. I'm excited to introduce Rachel Manzer. You can read Rachel's bio that she's a STEM coach who really thinks about not only her school and her district, but also some work with the state. So she's worked as president of the Science Teachers Association in Connecticut. She's worked on the curriculum leadership team on the state and federal STEM Ed Summit. She's working on her doctorate right now in curriculum and instruction. And what I'm really, I think is the coolest thing is right now she's in a hotel room in Dallas, Texas, because her 4-H robotics team qualified and are now competing in the VEX World Championship, which by the way, TI sponsors. And our third fabulous panelist is Candace Penrod. So Candace brings over 25 years of experience to her work, really thinking about sort of the lifespan of STEM access. How do we have STEM access opportunity and education? She has master's degrees in science and education from the University of Utah and is currently working on her doctorate degree in science education at Utah State. She serves on the board of ENSELA and the Utah Science Teachers Association. And she's coming to us tonight from Salt Lake City. And she and Brett have recently, probably not only recently, partnered on a number of projects with her Salt Lake City teachers. So welcome panelists, and I'm gonna hand the mic over to Brett to kick off our discussion.
Good evening. Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate that introduction, and I appreciate the teachers that are here this evening and educators to participate in our little presentation this evening. We're going to talk about cross-cutting concepts and their role in prompting students in sense-making. And I like to think about this word sense-making. We use it all the time, and I have been asked by teachers, what do we mean by sense-making? Well, in science, what we do is we construct explanations for the cause of phenomena. And so when we are thinking about sense-making that students do, we're thinking about them constructing explanation for the cause of phenomena. The shift in science education has gone from learning about the ideas of science to now using those ideas to make sense of phenomena. Next slide, please. So tonight we're going to discuss the cross-cutting concepts. We're going to engage you in maybe shifting some student performances from being 1- and 2-dimensional to being 3-dimensional by adding the cross-cutting concepts. We're going to talk about this approach to instruction that we call science investigation, and how critical it is that students have facility with the cross-cutting concepts to make sense of these phenomena, which is central to science education in the 21st century. Next slide, please. So where did this all come from? Well, the framework for K-12 science education brought together this idea that science is something that students should be doing. And there are these 3 dimensions that work together to support students investigating phenomena. The role of the cross-cutting concepts is really to focus students on specific aspects of phenomena and to help them find phenomena to investigate. We think about the NGSS as a set of standards, but they are nothing more than assessment standards. Your state standards or assessment standards. They are not curriculum. Curriculum is much broader. And when we engage students in that curriculum, in that science learning in your classroom, we're going to engage them in many performances, not that simple single one that's for that standard LS 1-1. It's going to be across many performances that lead to students' understanding of very complex ideas about science. So let's think about when we're engaging students in performances, it should be three-dimensional. Each of the dimensions serve a role, practices, cross-cutting concepts, and core ideas. And the cross-cutting concepts we're going to talk about tonight. Next slide, please. But I can't talk about them alone. I have to really talk about them in light of the other two dimensions. I've heard many district people say, we're going to start with the practices and move to the cross-cutting concepts, then on to the core ideas. That's not how this curriculum was designed. That's not how the standards were designed in your state. If they're three-dimensional, it's about three-dimensional performances. And so we want to engage them in all three. This book here describes something very important. One of the findings of this book, this Science and Engineering for grades 6 through 12, investigation and design at the center, is that investigation and design are more effective for supporting student learning than traditional teaching methods. That conclusion has to be supported by evidence, and it is. So if we believe that investigation is more effective way to teach science, we need to come up with the best way to present investigations of phenomena to students. We need to arm them with all the tools they can possess, the practices, the cross-cutting concepts, and the core ideas, and send them into the world armed to make sense of the phenomena that they see around them every day. Next slide, please. When we talk about science investigation, it's much more than that practice number 3, plan and carry out an investigation. We're talking about the full endeavor of doing science. Investigation is the research they do to obtain information. It is the experiments they do to collect data. It is the constructing of explanations, the development of models. It's all aspects of science. It is the core ideas as part of the investigation, as well as the cross-cutting concept. Investigation is the full endeavor of doing science. And so when we talk about scientific investigation, we want to engage kids in making sense of phenomena. We need to have a logical sequence that they go through to gather the information they need to make sense of that phenomenon. Next slide, please. The sequence that we like to share with teachers, and what I think is a useful approach, is organizing our practices according to how students use them. Some of the practices are really about gathering information and data. The information and data that students gather is then used to make sense of a phenomena. And then finally, as with all science, we want our students to communicate their reasoning. We want them to communicate their reasoning through models, explanations, or arguments for how the evidence they've gathered supports the explanation. But the key to it is the gathering phase, where they're gathering specific things to make sense of that phenomena. We're fueling them for their thinking in the reasoning phase. This instructional sequence is called GRC, and it's an approach that engages students in investigation. Next slide, please. So if I think about this sequence of gathering, reasoning, communicating, it has to be preceded in science with, in fact, that idea that they're observing phenomena and developing questions. That's the key. We want students to be able to, in our classrooms, make observations of phenomena, develop questions, and then go into gathering information and data to make sense of it, reasoning those explanations and arguments, and then finally communicating their reasoning. But if we are to do science the way the framework describes it, it's not enough to do science in our classrooms. We need to do science beyond the classroom. We want to engage our students in doing science when they're out in the real world. I used to tell my students in chemistry, I want you to be doing science all the time. And I want you to, when you walk out in the parking lot, when you pass my old rusty pickup truck, I want you to look at that truck and say, hey, That's an oxidation reduction reaction. Oxygen from the atmosphere is combining with iron in Mr. Molding's truck, and it's making iron oxide. That's an oxidation reduction reaction. That's the application of science from my chemistry classroom beyond the classroom. When you see the English teacher handing out the papers and you see her breathing out, that's breathing out the carbon dioxide from an oxidation reduction reaction, burning sugars in each of her cells of her body. I want you to think about the world in which you live in terms of phenomena you observe and explanations for what causes those phenomena. So we want our kids to apply the science learned in the classroom beyond the classroom to make sense of the relevant phenomena in their world. I noticed the other day that there are raspberries coming up in my lawn, and they look very much like my neighbor's raspberries. That's a phenomenon. Now, I probably know what it is, but I still want to be thinking about what's causing that phenomenon to occur. A 7th grade student, that's a great phenomenon to bring in to talk about sexual and asexual reproduction. Did those strawberries come over from seeds, from the birds eating the berries and dropping seeds in my lawn? Or was there asexual reproduction? So those are the questions the students should be asking, and then they're going to do investigation to determine what causes that phenomenon to occur. So phenomena as simple as raspberries are growing in my lawn that look very much like the raspberries in my neighbor's yard becomes a phenomenon that they can make sense of. When you have a phenomenon, it really is an effect. I always make in lessons that we write with teachers, we always put the phenomenon in green because it's a cross-cutting concept of effect. So if I think about cause and effect, and that's what science is about, constructing the explanation of cause of phenomena, the phenomena is in fact the effect. Now I've got to backtrack and make sense of that through science investigation. The cross-cutting concepts are going to be the way I focus that investigation. How does the structure of those raspberries in my neighbor's yard function to lead to raspberries in my yard? Is it the reproductive part of the system, or is it part of the root system, which reproduces asexually? I'm going to be thinking about those things to solve that phenomenon that I see in my small world. I want my students to become curious as I am. We can use curiosity to motivate students to think. So as we're thinking about how do we prompt our students, we have some questions later to talk about that. I want you to think about, will the cross-cutting concepts help focus them on specific aspects of the phenomena that they engage in? Peter, next slide. So here's our cross-cutting concepts, and there's 7 of them. When I was working on the framework, I was doing professional development with elementary teachers, and I got all excited. Hey, we have these cross-cutting concepts. Let me show them to you. And they said, well, that's all well and good, Brett, but how do the kids use them? Could you organize them, make it a little simpler? And we thought about that for a while, and then we shifted it to this other approach to the cross-cutting concepts. Next slide, please. We've organized the cross-cutting concepts according to those that are about causality. Now in science, everything has a cause. If it doesn't have a cause, we're not going to study it in science. And so the causality has 2 cross-cutting concepts: cause and effect, and structure and function. Those are both related to causality. And so we're either looking for kids coming up with how the structure causes a specific function, or how the changes in the system cause an effect to occur, or cause the phenomena to occur. So we organize the cross-cutting concepts according to causality, systems. All phenomena happen inside of systems. They don't just happen out in the world somewhere. They happen within systems. And by describing those systems in terms of energy and matter, stability and change, scale, proportion, and quantity, I'm able to define the system and how changes in that system are caused. And then finally, patterns. Patterns we use as evidence. Sometimes we use patterns to find phenomena. If I see a number of trees standing vertical and one's leaning over, that's a phenomenon. I didn't notice that leaning. If all the trees are leaning, it's probably not going to, in the world, if all the trees lean in the world, it's not a phenomenon. I see it because the pattern is broken in that system. So I'm going to use the patterns in data or patterns in observations to make sense of the world. Now, Candace is in a district, and you work a lot with elementary teachers, and they're the ones that caused me to rethink about how do we organize the way the students use these cross-cutting concepts. Candace, do you have some thoughts on that?
Sure, Brett. Hi, I'm Candace. So yeah, I think it's really important to realize, especially in the lower grades, to pick cross-cutting concepts that are easier for the students to conceptualize. So something like patterns is a really important concept in the lower grade levels. And it's really good when you can use that cross-cutting concept in multiple contexts with your students and also with teachers, and getting them to see how looking at a pattern, for example, in the moon, when the moon is rising and the moon is setting, is really important, but also looking at a pattern if you put a force on something and whether it makes something to move through a push or a pull. So it's really important to help teachers see this. I do a lot of professional learning with teachers and to really focus on these things. And it really does help having these three different kind of thinking frames for cross-cutting concepts, so it doesn't seem as over large and looming on teachers when they can see these things. And I will say, something like energy and matter, for example, is pretty abstract. They all are, but a lot more abstract maybe than patterns. And so I think it's also really important to take that into consideration anytime you're working with teachers and with their students. And, what is the cognitive ability of these students, and at what level can we really talk about some of these things? Patterns, in a lot of ways, can be seen in observations, not all patterns, but matter and energy, a lot of time we're talking about scales that are too small to be seen. And so we need to pay attention to that, and that we're making sure we're on an appropriate level for our students.
Thank you, Candace. Candace brought up something there about being abstract. These are concepts. All concepts are abstract. And that's one of the things why we want to really help kids understand how to take this abstract idea of even matter and energy. The cross-cutting concepts, there's matter conserve energies, conserve matter cycles, energy flows. Those are concepts. They're not, this object's made of matter. It's not a definition. It is the idea of conservation of matter, conservation of energy, transfer of energy, and the cycling of matter. And so we want to think really carefully about, as we introduce these, if they're introduced in context, students are more easily able to learn them. Trying to define these words up front for kids and then having them use that definition is not an effective approach to instruction. What's effective is having students conceptualize them as they use them in science investigations. Next slide, please. So, kind of emphasizing and bringing out a little bit of the cross-cutting concepts, focus investigation. We think that if we have an investigation, we want to focus kids on specific aspects of an investigation. We might use, statements like this, determine how structure affects the function of the phenomena in general terms. And we could put in any phenomena in that particular thing if it's about a structure-function relationship. Not all cross-cutting concepts always work. Some of the cross-cutting concepts work better with some than others. And when we talk about the focus of the systems, it's really about defining systems. Now, Rachel, you're working with kids in a competition there, and everything they're doing is operating within a system. Talk a little bit about systems for us.
That I certainly can. So yes, my kids are competing at the VEX World Championship, which is an incredible accomplishment. But everything they do is within a system. It's not necessarily you're looking at just one component. It's looking at the robot and the pieces as a whole and how they work together and what can they accomplish together, not independently. So if one thing goes wrong, no, it's not just one thing goes wrong, it's a system that is going wrong.
And also the energy in the system, the flow of energy in the system affects those robots significantly.
That
Next
is
slide,
correct.
please. So here's a little, on the left-hand side, we have construct an explanation for why few organisms live in the Great Salt Lake. So that might be something I asked, a performance. That's two-dimensional. I want you to think about what would we fill in the blank sort of thing to make it three-dimensional. What cross-cutting concept would in fact be the best for this performance? Now, performance is what the students do, and they need to be three-dimensional. So I'm putting into this particular thing here, what would be the cross-cutting concepts of work? Or the next one, investigate how roots worked. Peter, you're one slide faster than I am. The next one, investigate how roots work to help plants live. That's a great performance. It describes an investigation. And construct an explanation for how sunlight speeds up a chemical reaction. All three of those are, in fact, ways we would investigate different types of phenomena the kids would see. Why did the plastic milk jug sitting in the sun rot and fall apart and the one in the garage not? Even though I drank the milk out both on the same day, I left one out for a month in the sun, it fell apart. The one in the garage didn't. That might be how I would introduce that last one. But what would the cross-cutting concept add to each of those performances I am asking kids to do? Click,
And
Peter.
Brett, before you move on, this is a really good moment, maybe for participants to just think. You can choose to write it in the chat or not, but just take a moment and think, how would you add cross-cutting concepts to this? And how would it change this task? So if you were going to add a cross-cutting concept to each of these, what cross-cutting concept would it be? And how would it change this? How would it focus these tasks?
Stacy, I actually think if you add the right cross-cutting concept, it makes the task easier.
I totally agree, Brett. I was starting to type that into the chat and I just decided to start talking instead.
Yeah. I heard
absolutely.
assessment people saying, we've got 2 dimensions. Why do we need this 3rd dimension?
Yes.
And to make the test easier, because we want to focus. Every question, every performance task should have a cross-cutting concept so the kids know what you're talking about and you're focusing them. So when we put cross-cutting concepts in here, it should make these performances clearer, more focused, easier for the students to do.
Absolutely, Brett. And in addition to that, for me, they give you a starting place. So I don't know if you're ready to share the other side of the slide, Peter, but I think let's look at this first one. So it's constructing an explanation. That's a really big task, right? Construct an explanation, but now we're talking about scale, proportion, and quantity. Scale, proportion, and quantity is helping me kind of focus in on some aspect of this really big task. So the cross-cutting concepts, I think of them like giving you a foothold. They give you a starting place, like, I know how to do this now. So it's investigate how roots work to help plants live. That's a good task, but it's really broad. But thinking about how the structure of roots functions to help plants live, that gives me something to do with this task.
Okay, so those were performance tasks that we described there. Now we're looking at questions. How would we focus these 3 questions to make them a little bit more specific? So the phenomenon was last week I had a cut on my hand and now it's healed. That's a phenomenon. That's something that's relevant to kids. They've picked at that scab and watched that healing process happen, or they've left it alone and watched the healing process happen. That's a phenomenon. Here's some questions the teacher might ask. And I'll tell you right now, sometimes when I'd ask kids a question in chemistry, they would give me an answer that had nothing to do with what I thought they were going to answer. And it was typically because I didn't focus my question well. I did not give them enough information in that question so they could answer it. And so they answered something. It's an answer. It's not what I imagined. And it doesn't bring in the core idea I had in mind, but it is an answer to the question I asked. We can use cross-cutting concepts to seriously improve our questions we ask for students. So, Peter, do you want to show them what we thought about here? Because what we're going to ask you to do in a little while is you will give you a set of them that you're going to do on as a task. So the ones that we thought here for questions might be the following. Peter, what patterns of change did you observe over time as the cut healed? The next one is about skin systems interact to provide the matter needed to heal? And how does the structure of skin cells change to produce new cells to heal the cut? We know
Brett,
that.
I love that last one as a former bio teacher because mitosis, if you're just teaching the phases of mitosis without context, is just so sad and boring. And I think that bringing in these ideas about, it's not about whether you know which phase anaphase is, but it's about how does the skin structured to make this work? I'm wondering.
And it's about change. A lot of our
Yeah.
phenomena are focused with the word change. You know, how does the structure change? You know, and that's all about mitosis. And we can learn about mitosis, then come back and talk about cellular reproduction. And but starting out with how does the structure of skin cell, I've focused you on the structure of that skin cell. And how does it change to produce a new cell to produce new cells to heal the cut? So,
Hey, Brett,
yeah.
can I jump in really quick? I think this
Yeah.
is really important. I really think, okay, look at the second one. Describe the layers of skin and their composition. This is what we used to do in science. We did this a lot. Okay. And we, what are the layers of skin? What are the layers of rock? But what's really important is those are just structures. What we really want to get to are the interactions. We want the processes that connect the structures. That's what makes science exciting. I mean, what's really cool in Utah about all the colors of the layers of the rock is that the iron oxides that have moved through those rocks, it's those interactions over time that have removed rock, and now we have arches and hoodoos and all these amazing things. It's not just the rock layers. And I think it's really important to notice that in that first sentence, describe the layers of skin and their composition. Great, we know the names and the layers, but how do the components in the system interact? And then there's this even deeper question to provide the matter needed to heal. Now you're really getting at this deep content of interaction between parts of a system. And I think that's been missing in science for a long time. And I just want to really point that out so you can see the difference even in the cognitive level of this task by putting in those cross-cutting concepts.
Thank you, Candace. Next slide, please. So it's your turn. This is my favorite part of every presentation. It's your turn. We're going to send you in your groups and we're going to give you this phenomenon. And we have put together a series of performances for this phenomenon. Frozen fish thaws faster than when sitting on the countertop than on a dishcloth. And this is actually a true life and relevant sort of investigation. My wife has these heavy cast iron pots. I hate them. I love cooking. I hate cast iron. I burn myself 50% of the time. And when I remember to use the hot pads, they're heavy and miserable, but they have a wonderful use. If you put frozen fish in the pan, it thaws it out 5 times faster than any place else in the house. And so I take the fish out, put it on there, and I have that bass thawed out, frozen bass thawed out in no time at all. That's a phenomenon. So here's a phenomenon. Ice cubes are spilled onto the countertop and onto a cloth. The one on the countertop appears to have melted faster. That's the investigation. That's the phenomenon. So how would we structure these 4 performances in sequence, developing questions, planning the investigation, developing models, instructing explanations, that series of questions, of performances, student performances in this investigation that I'm going to ask kids to do. How would I add cross-cutting concepts to that? No. How would you add cross-cutting concepts to that? That's going to be our breakout groups. So we're going to send you to breakout groups now. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to be there for 15 minutes. Peter wants you to introduce yourselves. And then we're going to ask you to use a different template for each group that you're put into. And then we're going to have you feed in the cross-cutting concepts and try different cross-cutting concepts in order to modify those 2-dimensional performances into 3-dimensional performances. Anything else you want to add, Peter?
The only thing I'll add, Brett, is to go, I would invite the participants to go to the chat box. There's a link that'll bring you to a folder And once you're assigned to a breakout group, go to that numbers breakout group in the folder. So the links are in the chat box now.
So welcome back to everyone. I hope that you had some time to think about these cross-cutting concepts, these 4 performances, and think about how you would insert cross-cutting concepts. Would anyone from the groups, let's start with group number 2, would someone in group 2 be willing to share with us some thoughts as you went through this process of putting in cross-cutting concepts and why you selected the one you did? Group 2?
So Brett, I'm going to invite Joy or Robert to talk a little bit. We had it felt like a whirlwind conversation. So I'm going to invite them to pick up any thread that they found elucidating or interesting or challenging as we were talking. And I'm also happy to jump in if they want a little backup.
We talked a little bit about energy transfer, and then we talked about what might change the energy transfer, and we talked a little bit about surface area, how that would make changes or cause changes in melting.
You know, Robert, I'd never thought about that. Now you mentioned that the proportion of the ice cube that's in contact with the countertop or the fish in contact with the cast iron pan affects the rate at which that would melt. I have never thought about proportion as being a possible cross-cutting concept. I've always thought, like you started with, about transfer of energy. That's interesting. What else did the discussion talk about? Joy, can you add something to that?
We talked about trying to give the kids an idea of understanding cause and effect of how heat is transferred so that they can use that to describe a larger scaled event.
Yeah.
And I kind of thought of, if we're talking about an ice cube melting on a surface and the heat that may be involved around it or the atmosphere, I kind of went to climate change and was thinking about temperature changing and melting glaciers on like a larger scale, but I teach high school, so that's where my mind was going.
You could start with this ice cube investigation and then move to climate change and glacial melting. I had not thought of that. That's a great leap, and that makes it very much a high school investigation instead of this middle school investigation. That's very good. I appreciate that, Joy. Anything else you'd like to add?
Just using models, because it's kind of hard for kids to think abstract.
Yeah.
And so if they have the ice cube in front of them and they have materials in front of them, they can explain what's going on. And by teaching them something in this like mini lesson, then they're able to take that information and move it to a larger scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that idea a lot. You know, models, especially with energy, you know, models are very valuable. And like Candace said earlier, it's the interactions that occur. And so a model that shows the transfer of energy from one system, the countertop, to another system, the ice cube, helps kids understand that energy's flowing from one place to another. That's definitely a cross-cutting concept that is underused, and it actually results in a lot of the causes.
Brett,
Rachel,
can I add just one piece, because we were just talking about systems as we were running out of time in the breakout room, but that is boy, does that change the way kids engage with models when you start talking about systems. Did I cut you off, Rachel? I just realized you were unmuted.
Oh, that's okay. I'll join in right after you're done.
I was just going to say that this idea of a model, sometimes when kids don't really understand the difference between a model and just a drawing, and when you're thinking about what are the parts of the system, how do they interact, it changes the way kids model.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and that idea that we're talking about interactions, and every phenomenon happens in a system. And by giving them the cross-cutting concepts that define a system, they're looking at change, they're looking at transfers of energy, cycling of matter. cross-cutting concepts pretty much frame it, but I think it's important kids understand there are cross-cutting concepts that are defining your system. And once they have that idea and simplified down to what is happening in this system, becomes one of the causes of changes in the system. Rachel?
Yeah, so as we get ready to share out with group one, they had some amazing things that they put in their cross-cutting concepts to make a change. But they, Keith, Peter, and Kathy had these amazing realizations also about cross-cutting concepts. So I'm going to let them share for group one, and group one, I'm here to help you or back you up, whatever you need.
It's kind of hard to follow that up. She's like these amazing things, and now like, gee, what if I pick the boring one or something like that? It's like following, somebody, super dynamic is the next teacher or something. Anyway, the way I was thinking, or way we talked about it was really, well, one tack that we did was investigating kind of like the how. So for task 2, where we were talking about planning and investigation to test patterns of thawing and gather evidence to explain the phenomenon, we were thinking of like, okay, patterns would be a great one to include there, and then investigating like, are there different materials that cause the process to speed up or slow down? And so thinking about an investigation regarding patterns, I really like the idea about scale then, and taking that into the next step that was just brought up. But that was one way we're thinking about incorporating that, as well as the fact that it was a little bit challenging. And it's good because I think we all kind of agree that sometimes cross-cutting concepts are the last things that are added on versus one of the first things.
Yeah. By the time you, from the phenomenon, almost immediately to the questions, you need to be looking at the cross-cutting concepts. One of the things you just said made me think about something. You said different materials for the surface could, you could do an experiment, you put them on different materials looking for a pattern. What cross-cutting concept would help us understand that idea of different materials? What it is about the material that changes the rate at which energy is transferred from it? Think about cross-cutting concepts, because that's what this presentation is about. You can phone a friend, Peter.
That's that.
Sorry, he's putting him on the spot. I was just going to say that even from the other thing, the amount of material. So you're looking at, you can go back to scale, proportion, and quantity if you wanted at that point as well.
What is it different between the countertop and the piece of cloth? They're both matter. What makes them different?
So maybe looking at it like a type of structure, what makes them different, the type of material, or some sort of investigation. I mean, I think kids would have all kinds of ideas of why, why something feels warm or cold versus when you touch it. Things like that might be some additional connections, but maybe it's a structure and function, perhaps.
It's absolutely structure and function. And we forget sometimes about structure and function. It gets it's the forgotten cross-cutting concept, but in terms of causality, the structure of that surface determines how energy is transferred. And that's a function of that structure. So that would be a good, when you're talking about having it put on different materials, that becomes an experiment now. And so we want to prompt this, how does the structure of a surface affect the rate at which energy is transferred over? So there's a lot of possibilities, but when you change, is about energy transfer, is about structure, you change your investigation. So we can really direct kids in doing things in different ways by the way we prompt with cross-cutting concepts. Very good discussion. Anyone else before we move on?
I had a question regarding assessment then, because obviously you use all the cross-cutting concepts across the levels, but a high school response should look different than a middle school response, which should look different than an elementary response.
Yeah.
And how you sort of like, not score, but provide feedback towards, the maybe a performance expectation or something like that. I don't know if you're going to talk on that at all, or if there are some references regarding.
I'm
regarding
going to
that.
now, Peter. We hadn't planned it, but we are going to talk about the fact that in Appendix G of the, I think it's Appendix G of the Next Generation Science Center, they talk about the articulation across grade level. And a good example is if we're talking about structure of these surfaces in the high school, we're going to be talking about the structure at the molecular level. And so sometimes the scale becomes the thing we add to make it so it's a high school investigation as opposed to a middle school investigation, where we would say one feels soft, one feels hard, one's made of metal, one's made of something else. At the high school level, we're going to be talking about the molecular structure of steel is different than the molecular structure of a countertop. And so one's going to transfer energy at a greater rate. It has higher conductivity because of the structure of those atoms. The metallic bonds allows the faster transfer of energy across that pan, and that's what causes the fish to melt. So absolutely, you would not expect a kid at the middle school to be talking about structure at the molecular level, but you'd expect it at the elementary, at the high school level. Good question, Peter. Thanks. Next.
Brett, in the chat box, there was a question that came out of group 1 around how to approach cross-cutting concepts in professional development. The question was, can you do a task like we just did? In a classroom, does a teacher give several examples for students of CCCs to the students?
The way I would do it, Peter, and the way I do professional development is I would engage the teachers themselves in doing investigations and then have the discussion afterwards. How did that cross-cutting concept affect the way you investigated the two ice cubes melting? I've actually used that melting ice cube in professional development. And at the end of there, we talk about how would your investigation change if I shifted the cross-cutting concepts to the proportion, scale and proportion, as opposed to transfer of energy. And so by you putting in different cross-cutting concepts, you shift your investigation. But in professional development, you don't tell them about that, or you actually engage them in the investigation. And then their curiosity, their realization of what's going on is what fuels the conversation, because they've engaged with the same curiosity as a student. And that's the key to professional development. It's not about telling you about it. Like tonight, this is not professional development. This is awareness. Professional development engages you in doing the performance at a level that you then transfer it and apply it to your classroom. And it becomes professional learning when you do it with your students in your class. If you go back and do this investigation tonight, what we've done tonight goes from awareness to you applying it with your students to professional learning. And professional learning is a personal thing that individual teachers do. And so, Peter, I think that that's a very good question. And I think that what we must do in professional development is, in fact, engage the teachers in doing these investigations so they have a sense of what students are feeling as they're going through this process and how those cross-cutting concepts help them come up with a logical and meaningful response. Okay, Peter, are we ready to move on? So I threw in here another investigation. This is a phenomenon that one of my favorite phenomena. The top side of a leaf is a darker color of green than the underside, and it's true across all species. And so you might want to look at 5 species of leaves off of trees in the yard and look for a pattern in the structures of those things. And that investigation starts with kids looking at other patterns across these species, not just the one that you're going to use eventually in the phenomenon. I wouldn't show them the phenomenon, but at some point in time, I'm going to get to a class discussion where I'm going to prompt the kids with what patterns in leaves did you observe across all of the species? How does the structure of the top of the side leaf differ from the bottom? I'm going to use my cross-cutting concepts in the class discussion. Classroom discourse is hugely powerful when you're working with kids that have already read about the phenomena, that have already investigated the phenomena, obtained information about the phenomena, and then constructed the explanation. When they come to the class discussion, we can then revisit these cross-cutting concepts to focus that class discussion. And each of those questions in a class discussion that promotes discourse is critical. And the cross-cutting concepts help focus those responses from kids. And so when the teacher asks the students, why is energy input important to leaf cells? The students are going to respond with energy. They're not going to talk about, they get carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They're going to talk about energy from the sunlight is used in the chloroplasts to rearrange particles of carbon dioxide and water into sugar. I'm now going to talk about the energy part of it, not just that carbon dioxide and water particles are rearranged into another particle called sugar. I'm going to talk about how the energy makes that happen. What is the role of energy in it? Because I put the cross-cutting concept in there. We prompt students with cross-cutting concepts to focus our class discussion. Discourse is essential in classroom instruction. We do not spend enough time thinking about what are the questions we're going to use to prompt kids. Kids aren't going to answer these questions on a page. They're going to go off onto a class discussion and they might bring up other ideas. But when we prompt with cross-cutting concepts, we expect responses that include cross-cutting concepts in response to what we're asking our students. Students say what we say. They don't learn this language by defining it. They learn this language by using it. I do not need to teach my 3-year-old grandson new words by having him defining them. If I use them consistently in his presence, if he's holding that object when we're talking about changing something, he learns this abstract idea of change. So we need to use that in our language. Next slide. 2 is better than 1. And that it shouldn't even be a question. 2 is always better than 1. Cookies and cross-cutting concepts in the same category. 2 cookies are always better than 1 cookie. But the thing about cross-cutting concepts, they're kind of like, you put 2 of them there, what causes the change? I'm going to look for causes of change immediately. And so we think that pairing or couplets really help focus cross-cutting the students' performances. And so I suggest always using 2 of them together. The next slide shows you some examples of pairing of cross-cutting concepts. Rachel, do you want to handle this slide?
I think Rachel may have frozen for a sec.
Oh, she does look very inanimate. What causes the stability in Rachel's picture? So I'll do this. How does the proportion?
Oh, she's here. She's up. She's up.
I'm back.
Okay,
Good question, though.
So we invited you to share this slide and talk about the couplets that go together and why they're, we talk about them in this sort of way. Why is a pair better than a single one?
That's a great question. So the couplets are incredible. And the reason why is because in teacher learning and in the classroom, it has further deepened the conversation and the discourse, and also helped to further organize and direct conversation about the phenomena.
One of the things that I always like to think about is if a cross-cutting concept is a lens, 2 cross-cutting concepts is a compound lens. And if you know how a microscope or a telescope works, you'll understand that analogy. Next slide, please. So here's some resources we put in there. The Appendix G of the Next Generation Science Center really does a nice job of laying out the cross-cutting concepts, the progression across grade bands. It talks about this organizing them in terms of causality, systems, and patterns. And it really is a valuable resource. The appendices in the Next Generation Science Standards have valuable information. I think they're oftentimes ignored. And regardless of the state you're in, whether you use Next Generation Science Standards or not, that appendices should be something that you look at if you're trying to teach in a 3-dimensional way. And then the last one there, and since we have delicate arts there, Candace, have you read this document yet, using cross-cutting concepts to prompt student responses?
I have looked at it, yes, but it's been a minute.
Let me tell you, this is basically what we're talking about tonight, is prompting, the student responses. And it has a delicate arch there. What cross-cutting concepts would you think about when you're thinking about that particular investigating the causes of there being over 2,000 arches in Arches National Park. What sort of cross-cutting concepts come to mind when you see a geologic feature like that? Any geologists here today?
Well, I'll, if no one else is going to say anything, I mean, I look at it and a lot of it's matter and energy, right? Because in order to have a change, you have to have a catalyst. And so when you're looking at that, and that relates to a system. So you're looking at a systems change over time to a rock unit. So it's kind of exciting. I was going to say, Brett, one thing when about this document is I think it's important to help students reframe their thinking and cross-cutting concepts also. Yeah. And so that's one practice that we work on in our district is, and I work on this with pre-service and in-service teachers, is reframing questions. So when a student asks, why is this happening? Say, can you reframe that in a cross-cutting concept? And I've seen teachers do this, and it changes the conversation in the classroom. Yeah. What are the causes of the phenomenon? And it also moves your questions from usually lower level questions, thin questions, into thicker questions, because saying something like, does the other side of the world have day and night like we do, is a yes/no question. But a question about, what's causing that, or what are some patterns related to that, it turns into something that's more investigative. And I think that's really important for students also, is to really push their thinking past an easy yes, no, especially in the digital age we live in. We want to really push this more deeper thinking and conceptual understanding of what's happening in the world around them. And so I just want to mention, I think that's a really important part of the conversation this evening.
And if I could add on to Candace, if you don't mind, one of the things I have found in my school and in my district in the training of teachers is that repetition amongst the grade levels, after grade level on the cross-cutting concepts has been key, because each grade level, they do get more complex, as we have discussed, but the kids are seeing this structure, this framing of their thinking over and over again. And the exciting part for me and for teachers is we had a teacher that was doing a discourse in a discourse circle or a scientist circle. And the students started using the cross-cutting concepts naturally without teacher prompting. And it was something we'll never forget. It was this huge smile across the teacher's face of, this is happening. The kids are reframing their thinking. So.
Yeah, kids learn the language that we use with them. If we don't use cross-cutting concepts in our language, they won't use it either. Very, very important, Rachel. So we're going to the next slide. Any aha moments or questions from the participants? Any aha moments you had or questions you might have at this point in time? Peter, did you have an aha moment during the course of this hour and a half?
Depends which Peter you're talking to, but I'll just assume
you, Peter.
I did actually, and I was thinking about that because one of the things I always found transformational when I was writing questions was using Bloom's words to help write like different level questions. And I always thought Bloom's words were very good for helping me think, sort of start questions and to provide different levels of questions. And so using the cross-cutting concepts in assessment prompts really has got me thinking in the same way. I wonder how intentionally incorporating that language into particularly one of the big struggles in my district as I'm working with teachers is writing performance assessments.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how, if we're making this really too complex and incorporating a deeper understanding or demonstrating higher level thinking by including cross-cutting concepts in a question in order to, make deeper connections and to go provide sort of opportunity for richer explanations. And so that's some of the ways that I've been thinking about using what I've been learning here into the work that I do every day.
Yeah, excellent. A performance task that doesn't have a cross-cutting concept belongs in the past century. The 21st century performance tasks should all have cross-cutting concepts, and I prefer at least 2. 3 might be okay too. But if it's a performance task, you've got to focus it. And I agree with your Bloom's taxonomy analogy, how and why questions, but how does the structure of the system? I think that one of the things we failed to do with teachers is help them understand that you need to have questions that direct and focus the students, because a lot of the performance tasks can go in any direction. These are the tools that focus them.
Brett, Wendy put in the chat box an interesting point. It said that she said that I think this cross-cutting concept help bring diversity to the classroom, because it's not the teacher just asking questions with one specific answer, but allowing students of all levels to think about the phenomenon and participate in the discussion.
That is fabulous, Wendy. Thank you. Very fabulous. Joy, you were about to say something.
Okay, yes. I like how using the terms in the classroom can allow for not just differentiation, but scaffolding and inquiry-based learning in the classroom. I was talking to one of my coworkers today. We're looking for ways to get our students to write more in the classroom. And I think using the cross-cutting concepts will kind of force them to use content-related terms that we want them to use to explain the phenomena that we're introducing them to. I think that'll be.
And using the cross-cutting concepts will improve their writing because they'll direct it. One of the things kids struggle with in writing, they can go in any direction, and they do. We want them to focus on an explanation. We need to use some cross-cutting concepts to kind of aid them in that process. So thank you, Joy. That's a very good insight. Kathy?
Well, I guess the thing I would add, I was thinking about, ultimately, we want our students to be able to use all of them, right? And be aware of all of them. It's not just that one gets tied to a particular activity. And so the example you gave where students were just able to use the language of the CCCs in a discussion that's, directed and focused by the teacher, but that they're able to bring in all of them, is one of those, aha, this is where we're going. Like the end goal, right, is to have them be able to go, wow, I can see this pattern, but I can also look at the energy here. And I can also look at the cause and effect. Right? I mean, we ultimately want them to be able to use all of them and be aware of all of them. So how getting more to a point where the CCC isn't attached specifically just here because I, as a teacher, have intentionally designed it this way, the investigation to do these things, but that students are aware of the whole gamut, right? And not just one isolated thing per the way our investigation is designed in class. So I love the example that whoever brought up about kids just being able to talk about it. And then, of course, not only teachers, being us as teachers, to being able to use the language of the CCCs in our questions, but students being able to use them across the board. I think that is the ultimate goal.
In your classroom, you're arming the students with a powerful tool that they take with them anywhere they go to make sense of the world in which they live. And that's the cross-cutting concept. Thank you, Kathy, so much. You guys have been great this evening. I think we're running out of time. I think we have some people we're going to turn this over to close out the day. Peter, is it you that finishes this up? But I'd like to thank all of you. And there are emails. I talk to teachers all the time. I just recently changed my email. And so this morning, no one emailed me because they didn't have my new email. That's my new email. Please email me if you have questions. I love talking to teachers. They're my favorite people. I love teachers so much I married one.
Well, thank you, Brett. I'd like to turn it over to Stacy for some closing comments. Stacy.
Boy, this is a tough job because somehow I have to take like in 2 minutes, summarize all this brilliance and wonderful ideas. So I'm just going to leave you with a couple of quick thoughts. Candace used some language that I'm going to steal for myself, that the cross-cutting concepts make our questions and our tasks more investigative. And I think that that's such a really good lens to take away. I've used the word focus. Brett talked about sense making, but this idea of it really engages students deeply in science. And I just want to second what Rachel said about students using this language. I've also seen this in classrooms. When teachers use this language, students pick up on it, and not just the language, it's not the word, it's the ideas behind the word, it's the way of thinking behind the word, it's being more investigative. So we are teaching them through these cross-cutting concepts how to engage in investigation in a more meaningful way. This is not easy, but it's powerful. And I think Brett showed us some really wonderful examples of how cross-cutting concepts can be added to questions, can be added to tasks to let us dig deeper into the science. And I would really encourage you, as you close your notebooks and take your copious notes from this evening, think about one thing you're going to try tomorrow. Think about one either question or task, some way you're going to bring a cross-cutting concept into your classroom tomorrow, and make note of 3 things. What's the change that you made? What was the impact of that change on your students? And what was the impact of that change on you? How did it feel? So take one thing and really try it out as soon as you possibly can while it's fresh. I would really encourage you all to do that. And I will leave it there. Before I turn it over to Peter, I just want to echo Brett's thanks and his encouragement to please reach out to us. And Peter, take it away.
Thank you, Stacy. And I'm going to hand this over to Wendy Peel for just a moment. Wendy?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Peter, and a big thank you as well to all of our presenters. TI is a big champion of education and teachers in math, science, and STEM, and we're always appreciative to everybody that we've had on some of these STEM exchange events to be able to partner with them and be able to have such phenomenal STEM leaders like everybody that we heard tonight. So we so appreciate you. And one thing that stuck out with me tonight as a former science teacher was, to quote Brett, he said, "I want you to do science all the time." A lot of people, a lot of kids, they just don't think that that's what's happening around them. And that's what we at TI are trying to get out to people, that there's so much that they can do and think about out there. So we offer a lot of resources and professional learning and things like that. And we're more than happy to share with everybody. But and we also want to, as well as the presenters that we want to thank, we especially want to thank those of you, and I'm going to give a big shout out since we have a small group tonight, to Joy, Kathy, Keith, Peter, and Robert. We appreciate you participating in the breakout sessions. We know you guys have busy lives and have other things that you could be doing. So we appreciate you being so passionate about your students and STEM education, and appreciate you joining us tonight. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Wendy. And thank you all. And I want to thank, again, Brett and Candace and Rachel and Stacy for a great presentation. Check out the chat box. There are a couple of links, one to a kind of a survey to get your thoughts together, what we'd like to see in the future. Another link is where to find past information on past STEM exchanges. You might be interested in some of the topics we had in the past months. But more importantly, keep an eye out for an email from Texas Instruments that's going to have in it a recording link to this session, as well as a link to the PowerPoint that was used in the slides. I really encourage you to take advantage to look through the chat box, make sure you have those documents from the chat box put into your browser. And I just echo everyone. When you're thinking about the the 3 dimensions of the framework, the practice of what the students are doing, the core ideas of what they're going to know. But tonight's session, the cross-cutting concepts are all about how the students are going to think. So I'm going to paraphrase Stacy, try it on Thursday. So when you get a chance to get in the classroom, try it on Thursday. Don't wait for cross-cutting concept Tuesdays. It's an everyday thing. So with that, thank you all for attending, number one, but more importantly, for what you do every day to teach our students and share the passion you have for teaching. So thank you all and have a great night.